Romanticism. Much like that in England, this style and approach to art does not approach it in an intellectual or rational way, but instead embraces the emotional, that which is very uncharacteristic of what's happening in France at this time. Francisco Goya would be the most significant artist of the late 18th and early 19th century in Spain.
The Spanish in the 17th century are going to control a vast amount of geographical territory, not only in Europe, but throughout the world. They control Flanders in the north, Spain proper, and then southern Italy, Sicily, and Sardinia. Here we have a print of everything Spain controlled, showing Spain itself, or Hispania, as a female allegorical figure, crowned and holding a globe with a cross surmounting it and holding a scepter in her left hand. We find that it shows the Habsburgs, the ruling family in Spain, that they controlled Flanders, Sardinia, Sicily, Naples, the Americas, and India, and were also allied with their Austrian counterparts and cousins. This meant that they controlled a vast geographical expanse and were the richest country in the 16th century. Now, the Moors had conquered all of Spain by 732. The northern expansion was only halted when the Frank or Frenchman, Charles Martel, later nicknamed the Hammer for the Battle of Tours, is going to halt their advance. Thus, all of Spain was under Muslim control until the Reconquista. Now, the Reconquista, which lasted 800 years, involved a series of battles, not only with the Spanish, but also supported by other European powers, including the English, Irish, and French, where they fought battle after battle to push the Moors or North Africans back into Africa. They then, in 1492, at the conclusion of the Reconquista, are going to expel even converts who want to stay in the country and convert to Catholicism. So by the 16th century, Spain will become the most powerful nation. We see the expansion of the Christian territories in the north as they press from France downward, from 711 until 1492, eventually pushing them out of their final strongholds down at Almira in Granada. Now, Spain would be the dominant nation militarily, and as far as their navy is concerned, they were the best and most powerful navy, controlling the Atlantic, until the Spanish Armada was defeated in August of 1588. Through a series of battles with the British, we find that half the fleet will be lost and half the Armada lost, as the British are going to claim victory and start their own dominance in the Atlantic. The final blow is going to be dealt to the Spanish fleet with the sack of Cadiz in 1596, where the rest of the fleet is destroyed. Now, in the 16th century, prior to the defeat of the Spanish Armada, the vast wealth and resources of Spain is going to be tracked by their trading routes with the Americas seen here. Between 1492 and 1504, we can see a regular route that would have taken them to South America, the Caribbean, and then bringing the gold and silver back to Spain. Obviously, the port cities of Cadiz and Lisbon would have been very rich at this time. So with the discoveries that we have here in England and Spain and Portugal in the 16th century seen in the map, conquests are going to remain close to the shoreline where they could land and easily conduct raids. But as the silver mines of Mexico and Peru stop producing at this time, we know that by the end of the century they're on the verge of bankruptcy. And by the 17th century, Spain will be the poorest nation in Europe. There is a stark difference here, more so than any other country, between the wealthy, the aristocrats, the royal family, or the poor. In addition to that, Spain in this century is also dominated by what later in the Romantic tradition dominates the mind when they think of Spain, and that is the Spanish Inquisition and the rather brutal treatment of heretical and political dissonance. Now we know that Spain has the most corrupt administration and the least tolerant view and treatment of unorthodox religious beliefs, for they would exile Jews and Muslim converts. Even though they convert to Catholicism, they would, of course, question them, torment them, and eventually expel them or kill them. Now what we need to remember is the Spanish Inquisition is not monitored and is not an arm of the papacy or of the Catholic Church itself, but instead they received the ability and the permission of the Pope back in the 15th century to start their own state arm in 1478 of the Inquisition. Thus it was primarily used as a political tool rather than a religious tool to ensure conformity to the king's beliefs and unquestioning of his principles and of his dictates.
With these events as a backdrop and understanding the situation in Spain, we see that the kings, such as Ferdinando VI, would fight wars in order to keep the Bourbons on the throne. The country at the time, however, was in decay. The cities were quite dangerous. They had not invested in infrastructure, and it was quite poor. We find that the agricultural state of the country was also quite backwards compared to that of France and England. And public education was virtually non-existent, with, once again, rampant illiteracy being the norm. So there is no middle class to speak of, as in these other countries we've been discussing. Thus, we have a huge underclass. Now, it is with this as the backdrop that the king would found the Royal Academy of Fine Arts of San Fernando. Now here we find that kings following him, like Carlos III, would curb the power of the church and the aristocracy and attempt to reform the country, promoting education, economic development, science, and the arts. He would build schools and would lend to farmers in order to help them modernize the way in which they raise crops. And he would also undertake many building projects. He would bring Tiepolo and Mengs to decorate El Escorial in the capital in Spain in order to bring up to date the style seen here. Rococo ceiling painting became quite popular in the later 18th century here in Spain, with artists like Tiepolo bringing the light effervescence, celebrating in allegorical terms the Spanish monarchy as seen here from 1764. In this De Soto en Su view, which opens up the heavens, connecting our view to the sky above, we have the Virgin Mary and Christ alongside Greco-Roman gods like Mercury, overseeing the ascendancy, the apotheosis of the Spanish monarchy, seen, of course, in allegorical terms as a woman dressed as a queen, ruling over the earth below closest to us. Here we can see the detail of this monarch as she's going to be surrounded by these other allegorical figures and crowned by Mercury himself. The design is the same that Tiepolo would use in his religious ceiling paintings, taking us back and forth as we move ever upwards to the heavens, with the power of the gods themselves being bestowed upon and condoning the rule of the Spanish monarchs. Unlike his Italian counterpart, Anton Raphael Mengs would concentrate his figures on the edges of the ceiling, much like a classical frieze, as we find that he's modeling this neoclassical example from Winkelmann. If you remember, the Parnassus is going to, in Rome, illustrate this new neoclassical tendency of designing very clearly right behind the picture plane, just as you would in a classical relief frieze such as on the Parthenon. Here one can see the apotheosis of Hercules and exactly how the figures are all, instead of flying above, carefully arranged in a classical fashion, mirroring that of his other very famous mural paintings. We find that King Charles III would appoint Mengs as the first court painter, thus attempting to reform the Royal Academy of Fine Arts on these neoclassical precepts of Winkelmann. Therefore, we find that both the Rococo and neoclassical art had made it to the capital in Spain. This is the backdrop again that we find Francesco Goya y Lucientes, who is going to be the most important Spanish painter of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Here we find that Goya is not going to be aligned with either styles, but instead a very original artist in and of himself. Goya would train in the provinces in northeastern Spain, specifically the town of Fuentedotos. Here we find, as others in the training style in Spain would copy engravings and plaster casts, and at 17 would leave for the larger city of Madrid in order to complete his education. There, we find that his provincial training made it very difficult for him to find work, so he needed a mentor. A mentor he did find in Francisco Bayeu, the future father-in-law of Goya, as he would marry Bayeu's daughter. Therefore, Bayeu and Mengs were charged with reforming the royal tapestry manufactory of Santa Barbara in Madrid to compete with that of the Gobelin manufactory in Paris. Therefore, Spain was trying to compete with the French. So they hired artists to make innovative designs that previously we find religious or mythological subjects would be the most common. What they desired now was genre scenes and subjects. Therefore, we can see here we see that Goya would create many of these cartoons or designs to be turned into tapestries from 1774 to 92. In this instance, we have the Maya and the Mayo, which is an urban subculture of servants or entrepreneurs that would have a very gallant behavior and exotic dress at the time. Now, the way in which they are presented, that being individuals in urban settings wearing the latest fashion, would remind one of Caravaggio. So if we were to compare it, it does seem Rococo in style, in that we have young couples that are out in the countryside engaged in what we could assume would be an amorous activity or some type of courtship. But it is much less cluttered than that of Boucher and is much more broadly painted. Now, Goya also is going to bring his characters down to reality. It's very earthy and very real kind of tonality and how he approaches his works. Very different than the light, fantastical, and whimsical styles of French Rococo painters. This would hang in the prince's dining room in El Pardo, which was a royal hunting palace just outside of Madrid. These wonderful tapestries thus are going to elevate through their inventiveness the status of said prince. An equally enigmatic painting can be seen in one of the most famous 18th century Spanish works, and that is the pair of the clothed and the naked Maya. Here, produced between 1797 and 1800, we have two oils on canvas, one of a clothed woman and the second of an identical woman now nude. Now this, of course, is very scandalous in Spain, for we do not have a large number of nude works, especially of women, outside of showcasing shame and sin. So, the recumbent pose, as seen in the work, with her arms behind her head, revealing her armpit, is going to be one of passive seduction, taken directly from the Renaissance, most famously from Titian's Venus of Urbino, which he derived from the sleeping Venus of his master, whereby a woman tilts her head coyly, inviting the male spectator's attention here with the male gaze, as of course the assumption is quite clear. Now, mistress portraits were quite common for aristocrats, especially in France, as we discussed. Louis XV had many mistress portraits made from or by Francois Boucher, and he also specialized in those. However, this was unusual in Spain. Now, we don't know exactly who the woman is, whether it's going to be a duke's mistress or Goya's own. And the meaning as well is unclear. Why make a paired painting or set of paintings or pendants, as you were, of the same woman nude and clothed? The boudoir element of having one's mistress painted nude is quite common at this time, but why also clothed? That is something that has yet to be answered. Now, we also have another set of 6 cartoons for the 4 seasons, 2 of which also that dictate or showcase low-class life. Here, with the Wounded Mason, we see the dismal conditions of working class individuals in Spain, with very dark and muted colors, thus drawing attention to the plight of the underclass. And there was a very large class of the poor in Spain due to the fact that they were underdeveloped. Now here we find that this reflects Carlos, the king, and his enlightened governance. This idea that we're now drawing attention to and not just ignoring the poor and what is happening, but we need to do something about it. That being helping grow more crops by modernizing agriculture, or through looking at urbanization, or creating new jobs and education. Now, the Secretary of State would then introduce Goya to the king's brother and finally to the king. Goya would then be named Pintor del Rey in 1786, the same title given to Velázquez in 1623. Now, in 1799, he would also be made first court painter, the highest title one could receive in the Spanish crown and in the Spanish court. Now, Carlos IV, unfortunately, the next Carlos, was a very ineffectual leader. His power was in fact usurped by his wife, who continually cuckolded him by sleeping with the prime minister and his son. In painting the family of Carlos IV here in 1800, finishing in 1801, Goya will self-consciously model himself on Velázquez, both of course in the manner of presentation and of reception of this particular piece. Now, we already know that Goya is well known for his portraits of the royal family. Here we have the portrait of the Duchess of Alba. Showing a detail here, one can see that his broad and loose painting style was well established from the outset, something that Velázquez also would master later in his career. Now, we must remember that Velázquez was also painter to the king, and here we have the artist's studio in Alcazar in Madrid, and a painting that would hang in the king's private or personal office. In this painting, we have a self-portrait of the artist off to the left, as well as the princess, the heir to the throne, the heir apparent in the center, surrounded by ladies in waiting. In the back, we supposedly have a mirror with King Philip IV and Queen Mariana reflected in it. Thus, we are standing in the place of the king and the queen. As the king would enter his office, this would be what he would be looking at, seeing his own reflection in the background. Now, the effect and the significance of Las Meninas as a painting about vision and visuality, of looking and being looked at, is certainly something that Goya would be very familiar with and was quite famous in Spain at the time. Therefore, we have an artist and an easel off to the left and perhaps a mirror. There are these genre elements that are very popular in Spain, such as the dog, others that need not be in the painting, such as the court dwarf. And so we have the same type of minimization, but Goya takes it further. And it's not as candid as Velázquez's, where you find that people are talking to one another, engaging in conversation, even playing with the dog. Instead, the family of Carlos IV is rigid, formal, upright, as though they are posing for a modern portrait as we would understand it. Now, lacking this formality and idealism of neoclassicism, however, we cannot state that it is as formal as Mengs, for instance. So the informality in realism does anticipate 19th century portraiture and photography. If one can imagine the straightforward appeal to the senses, stiff though it might be, of early photography. We see that reflected here with Goya. Perhaps his most original contribution to the history of art is his Los Caprichos, a series of 80 aquatints produced in 1799, which is going to be caprices or capricious fantastical inventions, subjects that are not taken from history or the Bible, but instead are meant to communicate a moral lesson. Here we have the frontispiece, which showcases this type of aquatint, which is an etching whereby you use a needle to carve into or scratch out a metal copper plate, then sprinkle a rosin powder on top of it. When dipped in an acid bath, it will bite unevenly into this powder, giving you the essence of tone here. Now, we find that Goya is going to advertise the sale of the Los Caprichos in local perfume and liquor shops for 320 reales, and is going to state quite clearly what they are for. And he states, quote, "Since the artist is convinced that the censure of human errors and vices may also be the object of painting, furthermore, follies and blunders are common in every civil society." And this specifically is what he is trying to communicate. He's going to be taking the foibles, the poor behavior and moral failings that he sees in his society and holds them up for ridicule. Now, social satire here is unlike that seen with Hogarth, as Hogarth would also bring in political satire. It was more common to criticize the British Crown. But as a court painter, Goya would not have criticized his boss so readily. At the same time, we find Enlightenment opinions are going to be waning at this particular moment in Spain by 1798. So the call for reason and logic is going to be fading as he's arguing. Here we have the traditional symbols of ignorance with these bats and folly seen in the owls behind the sleeping artist on his desk. Now here we find that this is human existence, where the evils of the world come when reason sleeps. If we do not use logic, horrific things happen, in other words. The caption below states that imagination, abandoned by reason, produces impossible monsters. United with her, she is the mother of the arts and the source of their wonders. There are two categories of the Los Caprichos, and we find that here the first 40 of them are going to relate to societal ills and this notion of social commentary and satire. Here, with The Boogeyman is Coming, the caption reads, "Bad education to bring up a child to fear a boogeyman more than his own father is to make him afraid of something that does not exist, thus mocking something relating to superstition and poor education which plagued Spain at the time." If we are to compare this to earlier examples of Durer's series, whereby we're holding up these moral virtues, we can see that Goya is now doing it with genre scene elements, with those from everyday life, not figures taken from allegories or from the Bible, but those that are utilizing this aquatint tonality at night with these anonymous boogeyman-like characters. Here we can find another one, but he broke the picture, showing once again this type of ignorance by way of disciplining one's child and how we should help parents in order to elevate society in general. Here, once again, with what a tailor can do, we have another kind of superstitious element showing people that are praying to this false god that is merely clothing put over a tree in this way. Other examples that fall in this category can be seen in They Carried Her Off and Out Hunting for Teeth. On the left, we see in a very dark aqua tint 2 anonymous men carrying off a screaming woman in the middle of the night. Obviously, this is not taken from history, not taken from the Bible, so we need to fill in what type of scenario is happening here. The same can be said of Out Hunting for Teeth, where a woman is going to be pulling the gold fillings out of this hanged man's teeth. Now, the second variety of Los Caprichos is going to be fantastic imagery, and these are going to be taken from an old literary convention of ways in which to describe evil as a nightmare, such as a fine teacher, where an old hag or crone as a witch is showing a younger witch how to fly on a broom at night with the owl above representing folly. Goya famously is going to have many paintings associated with superstition, arguably to mock these traditions so that he can elevate his society through education and to do away with these unnecessary beliefs that only cause harm. So here you have the witches' Sabbath, showing the belief that at a particular time of year, witches from around the world would gather in the wilderness to commune with the devil, bringing children to commit infanticide and eat them. Now, the old witch teaches the young one to ride again, as we discussed. So how might we interpret it? Well, this is going to be the moral of the eagerness one has to follow bad examples. And we know what the results are seen here. You become old and haggard in this way. Other examples that are going to be pulling from this tradition are going to relate to home remedies and beliefs in quack doctors, as you can see here with the chinchillas, or of what ill will he die? The notion that using bad medicine or putting your faith in the wrong people is more dangerous than even being sick or being mortally wounded. Turning to one of Goya's most famous paintings, a little background information is necessary. For as mentioned, Charles IV was quite ineffectual, and the people of Spain were very dissatisfied with him and the Queen Maria Luisa. Therefore, in order to support reform, they threw their support behind Ferdinand VII. Now, Ferdinand is going to be called upon by the Spanish people to ask Napoleon for help to oust his parents in a military coup. Napoleon agrees and is going to oust the king and queen of Spain, but instead of letting Ferdinand rule, the rightful heir to the throne, he puts his brother Joseph Bonaparte on the throne. This leads to a revolt by the Spanish people in 1808. All right, here we have one of the pendants, which you rarely see in these classes, where the people of Spain rise up and pull the French soldiers that are going to be occupying the country very violently off of their horses, stabbing them to death with whatever weapons they can find. Now, in retaliation to this violent uprising on the part of the Spanish, the French are going to, in this famous scene here, on the 3rd of May, 1808, are going to gather together random villagers and execute them by firing squad to set an example of what will happen if they rise up again. Thus, this atrocity is carried out and presented in a very emotional, romantic way, opposite of the rational approach we've seen with Neoclassicism. Here we find that a group of Spanish civilians at the left are led group by group to be executed. The lower left-hand corner finds the bloodied bodies of those who have just been shot fall to the ground dead, while those who are led to the next round of execution stand ready and waiting, with their hands up, with a figure in white with the yellow pants, the brightest figure, drawing our attention towards him, show us they are unarmed, that they are non-combatants. The next group of figures are being led up and await this horrifying future that would happen in the next few moments. The French soldiers We see what Goya has done here if we look at popular prints highlighting the atrocities carried out by the French in Spain. Here we can see a year earlier the execution of 5 Franciscan monks at the hand of a French firing squad. So we know this is in the popular consciousness, and so the choice of Goya to select a firing squad firing on innocents does have a religious connotation. The French soldiers, on the other hand, are shown as mechanical, as faceless, as all lined up in a uniform fashion, as this cube of light illuminates this atrocity in front of them. You find that the figure is meant to be reminiscent, who holds his hands up as that of Christ, a martyr on the cross, who, as the Spanish are going to highlight, they are going to be faithful Roman Catholics, whereby the French are going to be godless atheists, having overthrown the crown and overthrown the Catholic religion and the bishops and priests in their country in the French Revolution. We even have a monk with a clerical tonsure shaved in his head, right in front of the Christ-like figure, holding his hands in front of him, dressed in a monk's habit, showing that they are even executing religious men, men of the cloth, non-combatants, that you would never do this in wartime otherwise. The subject here shown by Goya is unprecedented, for it does not show victory of this type of battle like we would see with the promise of victory with the Oath of the Horatii, nor does it show the battle itself. It is, of course, one of these very anti-heroic and shameful periods in contemporary history. Now, this is going to be romanticizing a contemporary event, much like the modern history painting seen in Benjamin West's example. But instead, this is much more loosely painted and highlighting with a very dramatic set of lights in this tenebrism of the figures who are about to be executed. And this is set at night, right? So we find this atrocity is illuminated and carried out in the dead of night, using those techniques from Baroque art earlier, like Caravaggio, like those we saw with Velázquez, to amplify the feeling of dread and of the hatred the Spanish would feel towards the French, who would dare to execute innocents and civilians and religious men. As seen in Britain, this is a contemporary scene, but now not used to elevate or heroize a general or important historical figure, but instead to draw attention to a massacre. So this is only going to be popular, as mentioned, in prints sold at the time to common folk, to the lower classes. Therefore, now low art becomes high art. Now, the next series that showcases the horrors of war, otherwise known in this series, produced from 1810 to 15 as the disasters of war, records the 6 years of guerrilla fighting, where the Spanish would support this type of uprising against the French invaders. But this one shows, instead of merely trying to vilify one side, the French, those that are invading, he shows the brutality of both sides. Here in Los Desastres de la Guerra, the disasters of war, we have a series of images of the horrific things that were carried out at this time from both sides. So here we have This Is Worse, showing a body of a Spanish rebel who has had his limbs removed and impaled anus first on this tree trunk, whereby the French soldiers are in the background in their uniforms, right, mocking him. Here is another one, just to give you an idea, with the same, showing once again the Spanish uprising and hacking the French soldiers to death. And then finally, one that is showing a series of hanged rebels, whereby the French look on as very proud of their actions and very self-satisfied. Drawing attention to the atrocities committed in war is going to be common in the 20th century and in the same format, whereas Goya's The Disasters of War are a print series aimed at common folk and affordable enough for them to be able to purchase. We also have graphic design and poster work that draws attention to what happened in World War II or in Vietnam, right? So who is being slaughtered, who once again has committed these atrocities, and how do we communicate that to the widest number of people? As we can see, with what more can one do? Much as photojournalism would draw attention to the realities and the horrors of war in the 20th century, so too did printmaking do this at the outset of the 19th century. Here we have a man who's being cut in half, starting at the groin. Here we have others. It says, great heroism with dead men, showing the desecration of corpses after they have died, hanging them up in trees around Spain in order to show what happens if you rebel against the French, and these types of terror tactics. Not only does Goya showcase the combatants, the French and the Spanish rebels, but he also brings in the aftermath of the effect on families and communities as they're burying the dead and grieving their losses. Here we find at the very end of the series, he has this allegorical personification of a woman with her breasts exposed, who stands in as truth. And of course, the caption reads, "Truth has died." And then the next one, the final one in the series, is, "Will she rise again?" Being, do we have the ability to come back after these atrocities, after the French have ravaged the Spanish countryside? Now, with Goya, he has a rather successful career, but in 1792 he goes deaf from fever and things change. We see a growing disenfranchisement with society as he retreats from it. He moves to what he calls the House of the Deaf Man, the Quinta del Sordo, and produces a series of murals, or these black paintings as they are known. So these 14 paintings are going to be on plaster and are often taken from subjects of religion, myth, and genre scenes, like the Caprichos. Here we have an exterior of this house itself, and now we will look at the interior paintings. Now, between 74 and 76 years old, we find that Goya is quite old and bitter, and he specifically is upset that he turns away from the world that he sees is going to now have given itself over to madness and destruction. In his works, we see a repetition of certain grotesque elements earlier showcased in the disasters of war. For instance, Saturn devouring one of his children, whereby we find that the god Kronos is going to be eating his children in order to ensure that they do not overcome him. But in killing his offspring here, to prevent this type of dethronement, we find that Goya departs from the classical tradition in which they are swallowed whole. Now we find Saturn is this wild man with long hair who is nude, who is ripping his children limb to limb. And once again, dismembering them, ensuring they cannot return whole. The type of dismemberment one would akin to or relate to the disasters of war and those atrocities carried out by the French soldiers. As well, the other paintings show similar types of vulgarities and barbarities, with witches, sabbaths, monks, and people hitting themselves with cudgels, or these blunt instruments you would fight with. All very dark, very gloomy, and with very deep chiaroscuro. With these final paintings, one can see why Goya was criticized for his lack of patience and discipline. He disregarded the rules of clear perspective, of refined textures, and the licked clean canvases that were preferred in Neoclassicism. Therefore, the official painters trained at the Royal Academy of Fine Arts, reformed by Mengs, promoted the study of art of David, and many of them were even sent to study with him, including Agudo. With his death of Viriato here of 1808, we have a painting that is directly influenced by the neoclassical style of France and David. Now, this is produced in the same year that we find here of Goya's 1808, but is indirectly showing the Spanish resistance to Roman occupation. So instead of showing contemporary figures that are rising up against the French and being put down, we now cast that in terms of the local population in the time of ancient Roman occupation and their attempt to overthrow or to push out the Romans, this foreign invasion. Now we find that Agudo becomes the director of the Madrid Academy and continued David's Neoclassicism in the 19th century in Spain. Next class, we will continue on with Romanticism in Germany and look at the unique developments there based upon the connections to religion and distance from the Renaissance.